So one of the biggest mysteries surrounding Borderlands 2 is the question of who Tiny Tina's parents are, and while we do hear them during one of the echo logs that appear in the game, we never actually see them. Or do we? While there isn't a whole lot we can say about Tiny Tina's mother, one of the popular theories amongst the Borderlands community is that Krieg is actually Tiny Tina's father. After all, both are a little crazy, they love explosions, and if the theory is true, it could present some amazing story opportunities for Borderlands 3. In today's video, I'd like to talk about whether Krieg is Tiny Tina's father, and I'll be presenting a lot of evidence that seems to indicate this, as well as some evidence that points to the contrary. So I guess without further ado, let's talk a little bit about Tiny Tina's origins. So we know that Tiny Tina and her family were sold to Hyperion for slag experimentation. In fact, part of the reason that Tiny Tina has you capture Flesh Stick during the You Are Cordially Invited line of side quests is so Tina can exact her revenge on Flesh Stick, who is later confirmed to have sold out Tiny Tina along with her parents to Hyperion in one of the echo logs that is obtained from the Doctor's Orders side quest. Now, while the third echo log specifically mentions Flesh Stick as a Hyperion liaison, we know for sure that Tiny Tina was captured upon obtaining the fourth echo for Doctor's Orders, where we get to hear Tiny Tina's voice, along with the voice of her mother and what we can presume to be Tiny Tina's father. And here are both the third and the fourth echo logs from that quest.
Commencing slag injection on subjects supplied by the Hyperion liaison known as Flesh Stick.
Don't worry, honey. Everything's gonna be okay. Baby, don't look. Sweetheart, remember that heavy red rock I told you to hide in your dress? Pull the pin at the top, then throw it at the wall.
Mommy?
Just run, Tina! Run!
Basically, what all of this tells us is that Flesh Stick ratted to Hyperion about Tina's family, then Hyperion formed slag experiments on Tina's parents, and at some point, Tina's mother instructed Tina to escape, and eventually the player gets to meet Tina, and then you help Tina capture Flesh Stick so she can get her revenge. Now you may be wondering what this has to do with Krieg. Well, it's worth mentioning that Krieg is also a Hyperion experiment, and if you check his bounty picture, it specifically says that Krieg is Hyperion property and that he is wanted for approximately $100 billion. And it also appears that based on some of the things that Krieg will randomly say as you play through Borderlands 2, that he was experimented on with slag. In fact, one of Krieg's quotes specifically mentions a psychopathic purple liquid, and here is what he specifically says about that.
You're gonna scream just like she did. Open mouth, open heart, blood and noise forever piercing my skull, poisoning me with its psychopathic purple liquid. We watched it all and felt the knife edge splat down the middle. Can you hear me?
So, just like Tina's parents, it appears that Krieg was also experimented on with slag injections. It's also speculated that the line where Krieg says, quote, "You're gonna scream just like she did, open mouth, open heart, blood and nose forever piercing my skull," could be talking about Tina's mother, or at the very least, someone Krieg was in love with before he went full psycho. Another major component to suggest that Krieg is Tiny Tina's father is some more dialogue that he has, and occasionally, while idle, Krieg will say the following.
Where is she? Is she still alive? Did she get away?
It's often believed that Krieg is talking about Tiny Tina here, and if you think about it, it's certainly possible. After all, Flesh Stick did rat out Tiny Tina and her family to Hyperion to be experimented on with slag, and it does seem a little strange that Krieg would be concerned with someone else escaping. Perhaps it could have been Krieg's girlfriend at the time, or maybe it was Krieg's daughter, Tiny Tina. There are also a couple of other similarities between Krieg and Tina that people point to as well. And for example, Tina and Krieg seem to have a fondness for explosives. And I suppose there is the obvious, and that's the idea that both Tina and Krieg are fairly insane, due in large part to the trauma they experienced before the events of the game. And in the case of Tina, Tina's parents were killed, and in the case of Krieg, he was subject to so much torture that it just seemed to have driven him mad. while I'm not so sure about some of the similarities between the two characters indicating that they are related, it does appear that Krieg was experimented on with Slag, and it also appears that Krieg does seem to be concerned with someone's escape. Again, while I suppose it might not be Tiny Tina, he's obviously thinking about somebody that escaped, and the only person we can think of that escaped from Slag experimentation is Tiny Tina. Now that we've talked a little bit about why Tiny Tina's father could be Krieg, let's talk a little bit about why Krieg might not actually be Tina's father. So the first thing I would like to discuss is the difference between the voice of Tina's father in the Doctor's Orders echologs and Krieg's inner monologue voice. As far as I'm concerned, both are entirely different voices, as Krieg's inner monologue voice is way deeper than the voice of what we can presume to be Tina's father. And while I suppose it's possible that Gearbox could intend for that to be Krieg at some point in the future, in the current version of Borderlands 2, it's clear that Krieg's inner monologue voice and the voice of Tina's presumed father definitely don't sound the same. It's also worth mentioning that there's an article from Gearbox themselves that indicates that Tiny Tina's parents died and that she witnessed this happening. And the article specifically says, and I quote, "That is, until you find out why Tina is torturing Flesh Stick. He sold Tina's parents out to Hyperion, and she had to watch them get tortured to death in front of her, which subsequently shattered her mind and turned her into the person that she is now." This sentence seems to confirm that the developers over at Gearbox intend for both of Tina's parents to be dead, and since Krieg is currently alive as of the events of Borderlands 2, that would mean that Tina and Krieg aren't related. Furthermore, it's worth pointing out that Krieg and Tina seem to have totally different eyes and hair color, and while Tina appears to be blonde with blue eyes, Krieg appears to have brown eyes. And while it's possible that Tina's mother had blue eyes, and that's where Tina's blue eyes come from, if Krieg is the father, it would be more likely that Tina would have brown eyes, as darker eye colors tend to be the more dominant trait. And as for hair color, while we don't know what Krieg's hair color is, some of the other head customizations that he has at the start of the game seem to indicate that it's white. Normally, this would indicate age, however Krieg doesn't appear to look that old. Or perhaps Krieg's hair has changed color somehow due to all of the experimentation he went under. Ultimately though, the difference in eye color does seem to point to the fact that they are not related. Then again, we don't know what Tina's mother looks like. I think it's also worth mentioning that Tiny Tina and her parents are most likely natives of Pandora. Now, Krieg, on the other hand, appears to have hunted fugitives in his previous life, and this is indicated by a piece of dialogue that Krieg can occasionally say while he's idle.
If you ever kill an innocent person, I will destroy us.
Shut up!
No, that's the deal. You can kill as many of the deserving as you like, but the second your axe touches the flesh of an innocent, I'll end this. All of it. A razor to the veins, just like that fugitive we tried to grab on Hera. Remember?
Get out of my head!
I'll take that as a yes.
This would seem to suggest that Krieg has previously been to several different planets in the Borderlands universe, and while I suppose it's possible that Tiny Tina's parents may have been to other planets and then moved to Pandora, I would say that it's more likely that her parents are native to the planet, while Krieg doesn't appear to be native to the planet at all. In fact, Krieg is more similar to the other Vault Hunters, as everyone except Salvador from Borderlands 2 is from some other part of the galaxy. Something that I think's worth mentioning is that while we don't have an exact idea of whether Krieg is Tiny Tina's father, it seems like Tiny Tina would know by now. Now, granted, I suppose you could have a situation like Star Wars where Luke Skywalker had no idea that Darth Vader was his father because of the mask, but I think Tiny Tina would be able to recognize her father based on what he looks like and his general shape. After all, Tiny Tina is 13 years old during the events of Borderlands 2. The echolog obtained during Doctor's Orders occurs sometime before Borderlands 2 and Borderlands 1, and we know that only 5 years have taken place between both games. So Tiny Tina could have been separated from her parents as early as age 8, and possibly as late as age 11 or 12. My point is that it would seem like Tiny Tina would have a pretty good idea of what her parents would look like. And this isn't a situation where she was separated from her parents at birth, therefore she doesn't have any memory of them. It just seems like to me, if you don't know who your parents look like at the age of 13, you may have a problem. So I suppose to answer the question posed in this video's title, is Krieg Tiny Tina's father? Well, no. I don't think that Krieg is Tiny Tina's father, and while I suppose I could be wrong about that, it just seems like Tina would recognize him at the age of 13. Aside from that, Krieg's inner monologue voice doesn't match what we can presume to be Tina's father's voice that appears in the Doctor's Orders echo logs, and I also think that Krieg is not native to Pandora like Tina and her parents might be. However, with all this said, I do think that Krieg was probably being injected with slag and was part of Hyperion's slag experimentation program around the same time as Tiny Tina's parents were, and this might explain some of Krieg's dialogue that could possibly be talking about how Tiny Tina escaped, and it would also explain Krieg's mention of a psychopathic purple liquid. Though, I suppose like I mentioned before, only Tina would really know if Krieg was her father or not. After all, Krieg doesn't really seem to remember who he is, and there are even quotes by Krieg's inner monologue where he mentions that he's beginning to remember, but Krieg's alter ego brings him into check and suppresses whatever memories that he had. I think one of the bigger things, though, is that Gearbox specifically mentioned in the article that Tiny Tina became the way she is after witnessing the death of her parents, and that would mean that she personally saw them die, and at that point, there is no way that Krieg could be her father. With this said, it's possible that Krieg may have helped Tiny Tina escape somehow, explaining once again why Krieg's inner monologue is wondering if the mysterious she escaped. At the end of the day, though, it's going to be interesting to see how things ultimately play out for Borderlands 3 and if we encounter Tina or Krieg. And it's possible that I could be totally wrong on all this, and Krieg does end up being Tiny Tina's father, and if you ask me, that's something that I wouldn't mind seeing. It's just that my hope is that we finally find out in Borderlands 3, because I feel like I've been waiting all of these years to discover the answer. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like, and let me know if you think Krieg is Tiny Tina's father in the comments section below. Otherwise, click the bell to join the notification squad. Take care, and I'll see y'all next time.